Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Hale. Welcome. I'm the Assistant Director of Scholarly and Undergraduate Programming at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Jill Gage, who is the custodian of the John M. Wing Foundation and the History of Printing and the bibliographer for British and literature and history at the Newberry. It's a big title. And we're going to chat today about Shonda Rhimes' blockbuster hit Bridgerton and some of the ways that it intersects with Regency print culture. So just hello, Jill. It's good to see you. And so given Jill's hefty credentials, I just want to say right off the bat that what we're hoping today to do is not so much to pick apart the show for its historical accuracy or inaccuracies, but really to enjoy it and to think about how it's using this period setting in some interesting ways. I think it's obvious right away, the show is a luscious fantasy that's very deliberately a fiction. And so it has these super stylized costumes, these unbelievable wigs, these incredible hats, and it's just so lush in its textures, and it's fun. And it even does these things that I think are so interesting with where it will do a remake of, say, contemporary pop music. Take Ariana Grande will provide the soundtrack at Lady Danbury's ball through this instrumental string quartet version of the song, and I think that's just, it's playing with all kinds of things in these incredible ways. It's just very deliberately and consciously a production, and so it's sexy, it's fantastic, and we're going to try and enjoy it here today. And but I should warn you a couple things, just housekeeping matters. The first one is Jill and I are not going to be careful about spoilers during this chat. So if you haven't seen the first season, you've been warned, dear reader. So fly off the ship now if you don't want to hear anything spoiled. And the second thing is that if you have questions while we're chatting, throw them in the comments section if you're on Facebook or in the chat, and then we'll try and get to some of those as we go on. But like, we're gonna dig in with a few questions of our own first and see where that goes. So Jill, this show,
yes.
Yeah, it is so fictional and so conscious of its own fictions. And there's so much performance going on. Even I think of somebody like Daphne or Marina in the show, and they're obviously putting on shows of their own for some of the other characters. So get us started thinking about how do you think Bridgerton is thinking about spectacle and performance?
Sure. So there are three types of performers on the show, and I'm not talking about actors, I'm talking about characters within the show. So first we have people I'd classify as actual performers. So Sienna, who's the opera singer, or Will, the boxer, even Madame Delacroix, the modiste, and then people like servants. So these are people who are paid to perform in some way, to perform a role on stage or perform a role in real life. And curiously, these particular performers are also some of the people who are most invisible to the characters, quote, above them in society. So think, for example, about the fact that Daphne and Simon have sex in front of servants in a bunch of scenes, and it doesn't seem to bother anybody. And that kind of performance is one reason that Eloise at one point thinks that Lady Whistledown might be a tradesperson. So that's one level of performance. Then we have performances within the public sphere and the private sphere. And the public sphere was something that was very big in 18th century England. And I will say to our viewers ahead of time, you're going to hear me say 18th century, 18th century, 18th century. Yes, I know it's technically set in the 19th century, but I consider 1812, 1813 part of what we call the long 18th century. And the 18th century is really the engine that drives the show. So don't nick me in the comments. So we have the public sphere, and that's literally the public. So how people act when they go to a ball, to court, or to the park, or the theater. In that space, those spaces, people are very conscious of watching and being watched. And that's what those spaces are actually all about. There are a lot of books, conduct books about how to act in those spaces. the behavior was very scripted or pre-scripted or coded. So for example, when Simon gets caught kissing Daphne, he has to marry her. That's the way that behavior works, because that's how that performance works or doesn't work in the 18th century. And then there are performances in private spaces. So private spaces is literally what goes on behind closed doors. So within the family, so think of Marina Thompson, for example. And people move between public and private spaces all the time in the same way that we do today. So we still say, like, you don't act that way in public, or no one knows what goes on behind closed doors. So another good example is Simon and Daphne, who constantly perform for each other in public. And no, that's not a euphemism. I'm not trying to be funny. They do. So even after they fall in love and get to know one another, get married, they still, there's knowledge that they conceal from one another. They never know how to act with one another in private. And at one point, they even negotiate what their private life will be like versus their personal life. And that's a big deal to them. And so one of the important takeaways is that I think, for thinking about performance, is that this would have rung, so people in the 18th century would have loved Bridgerton. If you could make a meme about it, it would be an image of the servants peeping through the peephole at Simon and Daphne in the library. That's like the 18th century viewer, and then the 18th century like literature and culture in general. So that's the way that we can think about some of the performances in the show.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, even taking your first part about the performance of a certain kind of courtship, and then thinking about how they couldn't be alone together until they were married. So then this new performance, they didn't get any chance to work on any of those, to practice those performances. So,
and I'll jump in and say that Sienna and Antony are really interesting, because the performance that she feels uncomfortable with would be going to the ball with him at the end. She would feel uncomfortable performing in that public sphere, even though that's what she does as a profession.
Right. So, even though those are such theatrical spaces, you've got pyrotechnics and all this kind of thing, but that's not the stage she's used to playing on.
Right.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So one of the people who's watching, and there's all these different motifs of watching and performing going on. One of the most important is obviously Lady Whistledown. And she comes to us in this most authoritative, I think, for us as contemporary watchers, voice of Julie Andrews. I mean, like, it doesn't get more all-knowing than that. So what do you make about how she is imagined here, and the power of gossip is imagined? Is she observing? Is she just an audience member, or is she directing the show? And how does that work?
Well, she's both. And so I think there are two ways to think about what I would call Lady Whistledown's performances. And the first is performance in print. So Lady Whistledown is a constructed persona for an audience. And this also happened all the time in the 18th century. And so she exhibits what I would call rhetorical authority, rhetorical femininity. So authority and femininity in print. She says she's a woman, but one of the speculations at the very beginning of the series, I think, is that she might be a man pretending to be a woman, which happened a lot in the 18th century. But she's an audience member. She's a witness. She sees these things happening. But then what she does is she re-performs or reinterprets things in print for the benefit of people who were there, but also for people who were not there. So it's kind of like a literary public. And so we often think of literary publics as being imaginary. So if you write a book, you don't really know who your audience is. Even if you start your first sentence is, "Dear reader," you don't know who those readers are. And in some cases, she doesn't seem to know or care. And then in other instances, like, "Dear reader, Marina Thompson is pregnant," that's for a very specific audience. So she's performing really for 1 or 2 or 5 people there. And the other performance is obviously, as you mentioned, Julie Andrews. And that is such a red herring for the audience, right? Because she is presented as somebody, I kept thinking at first, I was like, oh, is Julie Andrews in the show? Like, when am I actually going to see her face? She presents as an older, wiser, all-knowing woman. So I, for a long time, actually thought it was somebody like Lady Danbury, somebody who is working for the good of people, oh, I know Simon and Daphne should be together. They don't know that they should be together. So let me figure out a way to get them together. So in that sense, it seemed
right.
like
she seems like that kind of meddler.
Directing, right? She's a meddler, so she's directing. But there's also this moment in the show when, for me, and I think for a lot of other people, and I'd be curious to hear what other people think, when she's clearly unmasked, when Lady Whistledown is unmasked as a young, jealous, naive person. And that's when she says Marina Thompson is pregnant. And that's not an older, wiser woman. That's somebody who's very jealous. And I also will finally say that I think once we learn who Lady Whistledown is, and I am trying a little bit not to spoil people, but I'm sure everybody has seen this. I think we need to go back. I kind of want to go back and rewatch the show and rethink everything through her eyes, knowing that it is Miss P. And because you talked before about how confected it is, what a fantasy it is this all a fantasy performance by Lady Whistledown? Is this her idea of what spectacle should be and what performance and love looks like in Regency London?
Yeah, that's interesting. A narrative framing that changes the way you might read some of the decisions the show is making, and even some of the places where the show gets kind of controversial. That's interesting. So I just want to reintroduce us if you're just joining us. I'm Mary Hale. I'm from the Newberry Library, and I'm joined with Jill Gage, our curator of the History of Printing collection. And we're talking about Bridgerton. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat. We're happy to talk Bridgerton with you. But since Jill is here and she oversees this tremendous collection of the history of printing and that we have at the Newberry, and thinks about these things all the time, we do want to lean on her expertise, even though we said, I wasn't going to be picking for historical accuracy or anything. We don't want to miss out on this opportunity. So what did gossip look like in the period, and what did the printed scandal sheets look like? How did it circulate? Who was writing it? Give us the scoop on this.
So one of my very minor nitpicks, which I will say does not dampen the series for me at all, is that Lady Whistledown's newsletter, newspaper, scandal sheet, whatever you want to call it, it looks entirely wrong. And I think we do have a screen grab of that here. So everything about it is wrong. I won't go into too much right now, but people in the 18th century probably would have gotten their gossip not from what I would call like a standalone sheet, but it would have been something they found in periodicals. So they would have had kind of the equivalent, like a gossip column in not really People or Us Weekly, but something more like Vanity Fair or Time or the New Yorker. The New Yorker might be like a good example.
I like New Yorker gossip.
Yeah, New Yorker gossip about town, like around town, and gossip would be found in pamphlets and books too. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I want to talk about gossip in periodicals. And I thought it might be helpful to give a really quick genealogy of periodicals and sort of gossip in the 18th century. So at the beginning of the 18th century, around 1709, we see the first English periodicals that were published on a weekly or regular basis. And they had names like the Tatler and the Spectator, the Whisperer. So they're very names. They were not gossip sheets per se. They were broader essay periodicals about manners and life in London. But their very names suggest the idea of watching and being watched, and somebody's out there. They were in fact a blend of fact and fiction. They were aimed at a middle-class audience, including women. And we have to remember too that the 18th century, the early 18th century, is also this moment where people become very interested in the private lives of others. And that's actually part of what gives rise to the evolution of the novel in the 18th century. So what they want to see into the lives of people they didn't know. By the mid-18th century, by the 1740s, there was a periodical called the Female Spectator. by a woman named Eliza Haywood. Eliza Haywood is one of the greatest, craziest writers, most scandalous writers, I think, of the 18th century. The Newberry actually has one of the best collections of Eliza Haywood in the world. She wrote lots of great, really scandalous novels about women taking on different roles in society. And she claimed that the Female Spectator, which is obviously based on the Spectator, was actually written by 4 different women at different stages of life with different levels of experience. And that's, again, one of the reasons Eloise thinks that Lady Whistledown might be an older woman or a widow. And I also will say, I'm going to go back a little bit and say that, previous to the 18th century, we talked a little bit about women. In the early 17th century, there was a lot of question about who should learn actual handwriting. And there was a writing master named Martin Billingsley, who suggested that one of the reasons women should learn to write is because they were horrible gossips and that they couldn't keep a secret. And maybe if they wrote down what they wanted to say, they wouldn't shout out to their friend across the room like, "Hey, Mary, do you know what Marina Thompson did?" So
that's a strange theory.
It is a strange theory, and I would
love
love
you had
to know,
writer's block, I guess.
Maybe. So I would love for Martin Billingsley to know that he spawned a whole industry of women and gossip. So we have these periodicals that were kind of gossipy, but they weren't entirely. Wasn't straight gossip, but it was more about being watched and watching others. So by the mid to late 18th century, though, there are lots of gossip columns in print and in weekly or monthly periodicals. And my favorite is from a magazine called Town and Country, which is not the same Town and Country that still exists today, I think. But it had a gossip column called Tête-à-Tête that always featured rakish biographies of a man and a woman who were intertwined somehow. The identities of the subjects were always they were not. So one of the things that Bridgerton gets wrong is that nobody in the 18th century would say Marina Thompson is pregnant or Daphne Bridgerton is being courted by the Duke of Hastings. It would say something like Miss B and the Duke of H, or a certain Miss B with 7 brothers and sisters, or something like that.
You had to work for it.
You had to work, but sometimes in the 18th century, they would barely conceal the identity. So in one issue of Tête-à-Tête, it has the gossip about Horace Walpole, who was a very famous writer at the time. And they even Tête-à-Tête, what I think is hilarious is they would even include portraits of the people involved. They would just give them pseudonyms, though. So it's a little bit like putting up a photo of Brad Pitt and just calling him the anonymous Mr. P, like as if no one would know him. And they're barely veiled. So they say that they called Horace Walpole the Baron of Otranto, and his very famous novel is called The Castle of Otranto. So everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. And the Mrs. Heidelberg in the column is a woman named Kitty Clive, which I think is a wonderful name. And she was an actress who was friends with him. So yeah, they would not have named names. It would have been kind of veiled. And we see another way that they kept things, quote, secret, which is by using an initial and a dash with names. So we also have one of my favorite things in the library is a book by Hester Piazzi, who is a writer and sort of had a literary salon in the late 18th century, was friends with Samuel Johnson. She wrote a book about Samuel Johnson after his death, letters to and from Samuel Johnson, and that you can see in our copy. She, some years later, went back and filled in all of the blank spaces. What I love about this is in some cases, she gives lots of information about the people. And in some instances, she's literally written, "I don't remember who this was," or "I forget who this is," which talks about the ephemerality of gossip. Readers loved this. They loved the puzzle of gossip. Like the puzzle was even better to them than the information in the same way that it is now. And they would clamor for the keys to such puzzles. And sometimes they could buy a printed key later on, or they would fill it in on their own. So this is a great example of how print print culture preserves the ephemeral in terms of gossip. Otherwise, gossip just sort of goes to the wayside, right? Like, who cares what
Right, the
somebody
things you
thought about
cared about.
somebody in
Yeah.
1758? So that's, print culture is great for historians, like the historical gossip and what people thought.
Yeah, we have some questions from the chat. I mean, I have tons of questions based on that, but I want to get to some of these. Anita asked, what fueled the printed scandal sheet phenomena of the 18th century? What made this?
People were very interested in other people's lives, and it was a genre, and it was a popular industry. People could make money off it, right, too. So it was always something newsworthy. It was always, gossip is news, you know, and it was fun, and they were very, very nosy about other people's lives. Again, it's sort of the same thing about the novel. How could you see into somebody's private life? Well, you could read about it in a novel, and they were really fascinated by that. But they also, you know, there was a real morality to it too. And so part of it was, don't act like this person. If you want to be a good person and a proper person, you should not be kissing people in a garden, because then we're going to write about you in the newspaper and it will be scandalous.
That feels like a good cover for why I want to gossip, right? Just so I can learn what not to do.
That's right. Right. Yeah.
We got another question here. Were these scandals where the gossip writers were unmasked, or were there scandals where the gossip writers were unmasked, or did they usually stay anonymous? Yeah, I was thinking that about like the blanks and stuff. Is this because of liability law? It's you know, libel laws or that kind of thing? And yeah, were there any kind of stories around that kind of unmasking?
I think I can't think of any specific stories. You know, there are always questions, like with the periodicals that were written under pseudonyms. People had fun trying to guess who it was. And part of the reason they did do it was because of libel, right? It's sort of the same thing. One thing that's interesting that I won't really talk about too much here is in the 18th century, some people started publishing proceedings of divorce trials that were super, super scandalous, like shocking to me in the 21st century. Like, she did what to who? And that sort of came under jurisdiction of the courts. Like, there was just something that said they could publish it. I will say, people have, you know, talked about, in terms of Bridgerton, publishers often did try to keep people's names quiet for various reasons. There were lots of people, not just gossip writers, who wanted their names to be quiet. And so publishers would often say things like, oh, a masked lady came and dropped off the manuscript. So they would, and I will also say, going forward, I was really surprised that Penelope's unmasked as Lady Whistledown in the series, but we just see her in a carriage holding piece of paper, holding a manuscript. She could be the messenger. It doesn't necessarily have to be her. So
yeah, I was just thinking she could be a composite, like where you were saying those 4 women were running it. That made me think maybe right. We only have a piece of that puzzle. That's really interesting. So again, I'm Mary Hale. This is Jill Gage. We're here from the Newberry Library talking about Bridgerton. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. But that leads me to another question, and I could talk about these scandal things all day and have lots of questions about that content that you sort of suggested there about the divorce cases. But it brings us to this interesting idea of how, you know, behind all these gossip sheets, there is an author, and some of these ways that they're concealing or playing with it is quite artful. And I think that's one of the things that Bridgerton is thinking a lot about, is how women were acting and writing and creating things in the period. And I think gossip is so often a gendered concept, and it makes me wonder about how the term and the way that these sheets were treated, or the way that these columns were regarded, is just, you know, to what extent they were belittling of women's writing, women's circulation of information, and what are some of the ways you think Bridgerton is thinking about the expectations are, and maybe playing with, maybe, you know, not in a historical sense, but playing on those kind of expectations in terms of gender and women authors and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have thought about that a lot too, because the show is so much about the female gaze and not just Simon Spot, right? Like we get a lot of that, kind of gaze, but it's really about women's power, whether that's historically accurate or not, and women's relationships and what women can do with knowledge, concealment of knowledge, exposure of knowledge. I think it's no coincidence that the book is set, and the books are set square in the age of Austen, who her Jane Austen, who never published under her own name in her lifetime, by the way, really saw the world. And I think it's the women from Queen Charlotte to Lady Danbury to Mrs. Bridgerton and Mrs. Featherington, to Daphne and Penelope. They're really the people who drive the series, and they're the people who all the men are like dead, gone, jerks, incompetent. And even the people who are there, like, I'm sorry, like Simon is very hot. Is he that interesting? I guess he's a little interesting, but imagine if like Simon and Anthony, the show was like them in a club talking.
The Bridgerton brothers, I can't tell them apart. I can't.
Yeah, right. And that they're not very well defined. I mean, you would just put your eyes out with a butter knife if you had to like watch Anthony do anything, or Benedict. I mean, even when he goes to that Hogarthian part, like those parties, he's still not that interesting. So the show, I think, is really this. I think setting in the age of Austen, Jane Austen is so responsible for how we think about women and love and relationships in that time period, that I think it's really a love letter in some ways to women authors like Jane Austen and people who are less well known than her, and the creativity and the fantasy that they had, even though they were repressed in other ways. So I think that is what the show celebrates. Gossip is mostly a good thing in the show. We do see in some ways how it's not, but I think that it really is about the authoritative power of women, which goes up from Shonda Rhimes on down. Like, think about who created it and what kind of content they're trying to create for us in the 21st century.
Yeah, and that when I think about all these ways that you're fleshing out sort of the historical use of gossip at the time and the period, it seems like the way she's playing with the form of gossip here in ways that are maybe more familiar to us, maybe a little bit more Us Weekly. It seems like it's just another way that, just like doing a Taylor Swift, remake it's making it a texture that's familiar to us inside a period piece,
right?
That's thinking about it. We have another question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
We have another question from the audience. How widespread was literacy, especially among women in this period? So who is reading, I guess?
Well, that's a really good question. I do want to point out that their reading and writing were not taught together. So lots of people knew how to read, and maybe less people knew how to write, but lots of people knew how to read in the period. Literacy was high, pretty high, probably higher than we think it was. And there were actually lots of women writers in the period. And yeah, I mean, I think that literacy was high. I will also say that things like this, today we think of them as being gendered, just thinking back to your question about gossip being gendered. There were lots of novels about women, or today we might think like, oh, that's a book for a girl or for a woman, and boys and men read those same novels as well. There was less gendered reading in the period. I think things weren't so.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Siloed out.
Yeah. That information, that's maybe something I'm bringing to it, is thinking about that kind of information as being devalued in some way, or gendered, I guess, is another way of putting it. Yeah, and I just think that they're doing these things so consciously, and that searching for accuracy is one way of looking at it, but you've started to illuminate some other ways of thinking about it. So yeah, we'll begin to wrap things up. What, unless you have some final remarks or thoughts on gossip and Bridgerton.
No, I will say that the Newberry, if you're interested in the 18th century, we've talked a little bit about historical inaccuracies or what life was really like. If you are interested, I think this is a great entry point for you into reading more about the period, reading books of the period, or we have tons of novels, we have periodicals, we have books about conduct, we have newspapers and manuscripts you can read. So I think it's really a great opportunity to explore your interest further at the Newberry. And I hope that when we're open again, we will see you or at another Newberry program.
Right. Or you can get online now and find what we have digitized. And I know I, for one, am going to want to try and find some 18th century divorce cases now based on this teaser from Jill. So further research is required. But thank you, Jill. This is awesome.
Thank you.
It's fun to talk about hot gossip in the 18th century.
Hell yes. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And if you do want more information about the Newberry Library, about our programs, about our amazing collections, which span history from the Middle Ages to the present day, and we are free and open to the public, although the building isn't physically open right now. You can learn more about all these things and how to support us at newberry.org. So thank you all for joining us.